All right, here we are again. All right, so today we're going to finish up chapter 18, which is our discussion about oligopoly. And that's the last chapter in the course. And so, as I've mentioned before, the final exam will be based exclusively on those last four chapters, by which I mean 15 through 18, perfect competition, monopoly, monopolistic competition, and oligopoly. Okay, it seems like a perfect group of topics to cover in one exam because they're also closely related to each other. So here's what I'd like you to do between now and Tuesday. There is now, I posted them last night on the Blackboard, there's a chapter 18 problem set, and there's also a sample final. Okay, so what I would like to do is go over both of those next Tuesday so that you'll be completely prepared for the final exam. And that will be the end of the course, I think. I don't think there would be any point in having any more classes after that. I think only one more is scheduled anyway. So if we're done by Tuesday, then that would be the last day of the class. Okay, so in the meantime, I actually still have a few videos here related to not only oligopoly, but a long-term concept called economies of scale, which we briefly touched on when we talked about the idea of natural oligopoly. If you recall, we discussed that when there's a few firms dominating the industry, because of economies of scale, we call that a natural oligopoly. And so the idea of economies of scale is simply that as more output is produced, costs start to fall. In fact, specifically, let me draw you a little picture here. What that means is that in the long run, let's go back to the beginning. In the short run, we know what average total cost curves look like. Let's say we have just our average total cost curve. We have our average variable cost curve. And then we have our marginal cost curve. This is typical for short run cost curves. And we've seen this many, many times. We're completely comfortable with this idea, but it turns out that in the long run, things change because in the long run, as you know, all resources are variable. So that changes everything. So in other words, in the long run, all resources are considered to be variable. Okay, so this means that the law of diminishing returns no longer applies. That's a huge deal. And in addition, the firm can choose any output that minimizes its costs and thereby maximizes its profits. Okay, so in other words, in the long run, we can change whatever we want to maximize our profits and minimize our costs. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So here's how the long run average total cost curve is typically derived. We can derive what's called the long run average total cost curve from the possible short run, all the possible short run average cost curves. Now, what do I mean by that? So if you imagine that we have the ability now, we're running a small business, and let's say we're brewing beer. It's a small brewery. And in the short run, we're stuck with the resources that we have. So we can't do anything except change the amount of labor we have. But let's just say we're looking out the long run. We can build whatever size brewery we need to maximize our profits. And if that's the case, there's a lot of plant or breweries we could potentially choose from. So let's just keep it simple and assume that there's three that we're thinking about. If we want to keep our production small, let's say that this could be the potential average total cost curve for that small output. And then if we want to grow to a more intermediate size company, let's say that we could potentially have a brewery with this average total cost curve. And then in the long run, if we want to have a larger output, let's say this is what's available to us. So what's happening here is that each of these represents one possible cost curve for producing beer or producing our product. It doesn't matter what it is. Okay, so in other words, we get to choose. All of these are potentially available because we're about to build, let's say we've decided to build a new brewery where we can choose everything we want. We can have the right amount of equipment, we can have the right size, we can have everything we need because it's the long run and we can change all of these details. Now, what they will do in economics is derive the long run average total cost curve as basically a curve that connects all three of these. Now, I have to be careful about the way I draw it. It's meant to look like something like this. All right, like I said, it's a little tricky to draw. The idea is that it's supposed to just touch on all of these short run cost curves. And then the resulting curve, we call it LATC for long run average total cost curve. Which represents all the different costs we could potentially encounter when we produce our product, given that we're going to choose what we think is the best, in this case, brewery to build. So all of these are theoretically available to us. Now, imagine the scenario though. Now, if you notice here, they all have that traditional upward shape, and so does the long run average total cost curve. This is a fairly standard outcome, but imagine an industry like steelmaking, where getting big means that all of those fixed costs that you're paying are being spread out over a larger and larger set of outputs. Okay, so in an industry such as steel, where there are the fixed costs are very large, or I guess what I should say is the fixed costs account for a large percentage of total costs due to the need for expensive equipment. The cost curves, or the short run average total cost curves, may decline as output increases. Okay, so what exactly does that mean? All right, so imagine now this is my graph. So in other words, I'm deciding which steel mill to build. Okay, I've got all the options are on the table. I can build whatever I want. And so I discover that if I keep getting bigger, because I have so many fixed costs, getting bigger means that I can spread those costs around a larger number of units of output. So what if my average total cost curves look like this? What's happening here is that as I keep increasing my output, the curves are dropping in the sense that the costs are falling. And so my long run average total cost curve here is going to have a very different shape. It'll look something like this. And so what this is telling me is that if I keep getting bigger and bigger, I'll have lower and lower average total costs, and that will give me a huge advantage over my competitors. So this diagram represents what we mean by economies of scale, in the sense that as we get bigger, our costs are dropping. So we want to get bigger and bigger and bigger, assuming that we can sell all of our output, because the bigger we get, the cheaper it is to produce our product, and the more of an edge we'll have over our competition. So this is what's happening with the natural oligopoly. We have an industry like steel, where we may have, let's say, two companies that account for all of the output of steel, and it's because each one is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they can cover the entire market between the two of them. This is why, because of economies of scale. And so, as we've seen already, when this happens, we end up with what we call a natural oligopoly. And also, don't forget, remember we looked up on the internet, we discovered that this is actually happening with Kellogg's, General Mills, and Post. Although there's three of them in that case, they basically represent an oligopoly because between the three of them, they account for about 80% of the industry output, which means that most likely this is what's happening in the production of cereal, okay? If not, if we had this scenario, which is more normal, that would tend to mean that you would have large and small companies competing side by side. But instead, when you see just a few gigantic companies, most likely this is the reason, because of economies of scale. They're just so enormous that nobody can really compete with them. Now, of course, there's other reasons too. These brands have been around forever. I mean, I would be willing to bet some of these at least have been around since the 19th century. And the brand loyalty that they've established is quite strong. And that also prevents others from jumping into the market as well. But the majority of the reason for them being so big is most likely due to economies of scale. All right, so I just wanted to get that in there so you can see exactly what this represents. Now, by the way, I just want to mention that in addition to economies of scale, it is also possible to experience two other cases: constant returns to scale and decreasing. Oh, actually, you know what I forgot to mention? One more thing. I just want to mention that economies of scale is sometimes known as increasing returns to scale. You hear those both used interchangeably. So if you run across that phrase, increasing returns to scale, just remember it means the same thing as economies of scale. All right, so with that being said, in addition to economies of scale or increasing returns to scale, it is also possible that in some industries experience two other possibilities, which are constant returns to scale and decreasing returns to scale, which is also known as diseconomies of scale. So what separates them all is the shape of that long-run average total cost curve. All right, so let me just mention that right now. All right, let me show you a picture of what each of these looks like, and then we can go on from there. So constant returns to scale is pretty much what you would expect it to look like. You've got, let's say, three potential average total cost curves to choose from. And if you notice, they're pretty much all the same, except that ATC3 represents more output than ATC2, which in turn represents more output than ATC1. And so if you connect these, you're just going to get a flat line, basically. So this is your long-run average total cost curve, and this represents constant returns to scale. If you have that, then most likely your industry will have both small and large firms, because there's no particular cost advantage to being big. So you can have, like it used to be in ancient times when we had bookstores, It was not unusual if you were walking around Manhattan to find gigantic chains like Borders and Barnes and Nobles, but also to find local neighborhood bookshops. And they would be very, very small. And you could have everything in between. So most likely those industries were characterized by constant returns to scale, that it didn't really help Barnes and Nobles all that much to be big, although certainly they did survive. So maybe I shouldn't say that, but the fact that you could see small and large companies competing side by side is typically a sign that that industry is experiencing constant returns to scale. And then the last possibility, the one that we don't like to see, is, oh, I forgot something here, dollars in Q. Here's an industry where every time you try to increase your output, costs are actually going up. Oh, we don't like this one at all. Okay, so all right, well, I didn't draw that well, but the idea here is that it's increasing as we try to produce more output. So in that case, this one has two potential names. This is often called either diseconomies of scale or decreasing returns. To scale. And so that's another possibility as well. In a case like this, then you would expect to see only small firms in that industry because getting bigger is actually a disadvantage. And you'll typically run into this kind of thing when the business that you're running requires very specialized inputs that are hard to obtain. And as you try to get more and more of these inputs, they become very expensive. So here, these tend to be very specialized small stores that sell something very unique because they don't want to get too big because then their costs will start to go up. So basically, we're attributing the existence of oligopolies to economies of scale, or at least not all of them, of course, but many of them. This is the reason why there's an oligopoly as opposed to, let's say, monopolistic competition could look like this, or possibly this one. Because, even in a monopolistically competitive industry, the firms tend to be somewhat small. You don't normally see a single gigantic firm dominating the rest of them. And that would tend to indicate that returns to scale are pretty much constant for everyone. If not, if you had increasing returns to scale in the fast food industry, you might see a situation where all we have is McDonald's or Burger King, and that's it. But that's not the way it is. So that means most likely we're seeing constant returns to scale or something just like that. And of course, this is all, you might get this in perfect competition as well. That's why all the firms keep staying small. Or in fact, that also could be what's happening here, that with perfect competition, they don't want to get any bigger because they can see that that would increase their cost of production, and they probably would have to go out of business. All right, so that was my little detour into the world of economies of scale. And the purpose of going through that now is because it ties in so nicely with oligopoly. Okay, so now it just so happens that I've got, like I said, some videos here. One of them is in fact about economies of scale. In fact, since we're talking about that, let's look at that one first, and then we'll get to the others as well. And then, all right, let's do this one first. All right, let's check this one out. All right. So what he was making the point there is that in some cases, for the same firm, the long run average cost curve can actually fall for a while and then have a long flat region, and it can rise again at the end. That's also another possibility that I didn't go over. Um, but there's all kinds. I mean, in principle, any number of possibilities are out there. But what we would expect to see is that that shape of that long run average total cost curve will ultimately determine the size of the firms in that industry. All right. Well, anyway, now the next video is actually about oligopoly directly. So let's look at this one. All right. All right, now the next one is kind of interesting because it introduces a concept that we will be looking at today, which is called game theory. Now, you might think that that has something to do with monopoly and risk and all the rest of them. It's actually a way of analyzing strategies. Now, they mentioned in the video that oligopolists, unlike the other market structures, have to constantly keep an eye on each other to determine what they think they will do if in response to any moves that are made, like raising or lowering prices. Now, by the way, that demand curve they were deriving in the video, it does not appear in this book. I guess they decided it's too complicated, that it can wait till a more advanced class. But that is a good way of thinking about what the oligopolists are facing. The idea that is if an oligopolist raises its prices, chances are the other oligopolist will not do the same thing. And the oligopolist that raises its prices by itself is likely to lose a lot of revenues as the customers go to the other oligopolist. But if one of the oligopolists cuts its price, the others may feel the need to follow suit because otherwise they don't want to, they don't want to lose their customers. So the demand curve that you saw there was very weirdly shaped because it had an inelastic region and an elastic region. And so, but what that does is it reinforces the notion that oligopolists are interdependent in the sense that they cannot make any decisions without taking into account the response of their rivals. And so that's what game theory is an attempt to analyze. It's a structure for letting us look at decisions and trying to understand how these decisions are reached. But they do it in a very interesting way. They're going to set up a matrix of values that each firm can obtain depending on what actions they take. So we're going to watch this now. If it doesn't make any sense, don't worry, we're going to go over it again. But it's a very interesting concept, this idea of game theory, and it's perfectly suited for analyzing oligopolies. So anyway, let me send this to you right now, and then we'll get back to the notes. All right, here we go. All right, so they really just kind of touched on the game theory, but we're going to go over it ourselves so we'll have a better feel for what it's all about. So anyway, so let's jump ahead back to where we left off. And I think where we got to was right here, the so-called oligopolist dilemma. So here, this is a story about two oligopolists, and we're going to see how they end up deciding how much to produce of their product and how much to charge. So we're going to assume that we're looking at the aircraft industry, where there are two major firms, Airbus and Boeing. Although Airbus is not an American company, we're assuming that we're looking at the global market for aircraft, not just the American market. So because we're looking at the global market, we're looking at the two major competitors, Airbus, which is based in France, and Boeing, which is based in the United States. Now we're going to assume that this is a duopoly. There's nobody else out there. We're going to also make some simplifying assumptions. The two firms have identical cost curves, and their fixed costs are zero, and the marginal cost of each airplane is $1 million. Right now, this is all just to keep it simple. So in other words, neither one of these has a cost advantage. So their job is to really just figure out how many planes to produce to maximize their revenues, given the demand, the global demand for aircraft. So they can't ignore that. But that becomes the main focus since they have their the same cost curves. So the total demand for let's jump ahead. This curve, you can see the blue curve is the total global demand for aircraft. And it does look just like the monopoly case. The yellow line is, of course, the marginal revenue curve, which we've already seen is steeper than the demand curve in a case like this. And then let's just say that the marginal cost, as we've already mentioned, is $1 million per plane. It's a flat, it's constant, flat line, it's constant, which of course we know that that's normally not the case, but let's just keep it simple and assume that that's what's happening. Now, what this graph is really showing us is that, of course, we want to produce where MR equals MC. If this was a monopoly industry, if there was just the one producer, then they would produce 6 million planes at a price of $13 million each. Okay, so 6 planes would be produced every week at a cost of $13 million each. That's the monopoly solution. But we don't have a monopoly, do we? No. Okay, so $13 million, 6. By the way, down here you can see if we had a perfectly competitive industry where P equals MC, then you would have 12 planes produced every week at a price of $1 million each. Now, obviously, the oligopolists do not want to produce that many planes at such a low price. Because there's 2 of them who can potentially share the market, although we can't be sure just yet, we can see that it would make sense for the oligopolist to produce somewhere between the monopolist outcome and the perfectly competitive outcome, which means somewhere between 6 and 12 airplanes at a cost that would range between $1 million and $13 million. So how can we tell where they'll end up? That's the challenge. We know that they'll end up somewhere along this portion of the demand curve. The issue here is where. And for that, we do need to introduce, well, we will later on introduce game theory to analyze this. In the meantime, we're going to think in terms of how much each company can make if they produce different combinations of airplanes. So we're going to go through these one at a time, and then when we're done, we'll summarize all of this with game theory, and you'll see how useful it potentially can be to help us decide what these 2 firms will ultimately end up doing. So why don't we begin with the monopoly case? Well, all right, well, we've already seen the monopoly case. By the way, they mentioned in the video the word cartel. A cartel, and I think I mentioned it in here too, the word cartel means you have oligopolists who are cooperating with each other. Let's see. Here we go. Let me just throw this in here. Just in case we've forgotten what that means. Okay, a cartel is a group of firms that attempt to monopolize a market. The firms jointly agree on the quantity that each firm will produce and the price that will be charged. If the cartel is successful, the firms will share in monopoly profits. Okay, if the firm is successful, if they're able to pull this off, they'll essentially be splitting up monopoly profits. It'll be as if there were a monopoly, but they're splitting up the profits among themselves. But as I mentioned in the video, well, a couple of things here. First of all, cartels are difficult to organize and enforce unless there are just a few firms in the cartel. For this reason, cartels are normally only seen in oligopolies. Cartels are also illegal, so that the member firms must be very careful. Just like what they're saying, the luggage fees, the companies may not have actually called each other up and say, listen, why don't we all charge a luggage fee of $20 a bag? But they didn't have to, because if one of them just starts charging a fee, the others will say, you know, we better do the same thing too. And before you know it, they're all copying each other. And if they know that this is going to happen, they could actually strategize to ensure that they're all doing something which is profitable for everyone. So there could be an unofficial cartel where they're all sort of hinting at each other that here's the best strategy, why don't we all follow it? And that gets into gray areas for the Justice Department because, let's face it, companies are allowed to do whatever they want unless they're explicitly agreeing behind the scenes to, change their behavior. Then there's not much the Justice Department can do about it. And then, unfortunately, cartels tend to be highly unstable. Because each member has an incentive to cheat on the other members by lowering its price and stealing customers from the other members. Okay, so yes, there's a very strong incentive. They all say, yeah, sure, don't worry, we'll all do the same thing. And then sooner or later, one of them is bound to start cheating on the others, and before you know it, the whole thing unravels. So it's kind of unusual, but it can happen. So every so often you read about companies that are being prosecuted for forming a cartel because it's illegal. All right, the government doesn't want this to happen because it reduces competition. But let's just say that these two companies, and by the way, here, since we're dealing with two firms from different countries, the laws are probably very different in France than in the United States. So in other words, it's possible that because Airbus and Boeing are not both American companies, that there's more leeway for them to try something like this. Whereas if they're both American companies, then this would be absolutely illegal for them to get together and say, listen, why don't we do this? Why don't we just both produce 6 planes total between us and each charge $13 million? That can't happen in the US, or at least it's not legal. With two companies in foreign countries or different countries, it might be easier to do this. I don't know enough about international law to say one way or the other, but I would say that it's probably going to be more difficult for anybody to stop them. Let's put it that way. So anyway, so why don't we assume now the cartel solution would be to produce 6 planes total for $13 million. But if they don't form a cartel, any other combination here is possible. Okay, now ultimately what will determine how many planes they produce will depend on their total profits, of course. So there will be one combination of output from the two firms, which will be the best choice for both of them. So anyway, let's see, what other options? So let's begin by looking at the cartel case. Let's say that they decide that they produce a total of 3 airplanes per week, 6 rather, sorry, 6. The monopoly case, 6 airplanes a week. They're going to receive a total revenue, if you look at this curve, of $78 million. 6 planes, $13 million each. Altogether, the revenues in this industry will be $78 million. The cost, though, will be $6 million because each plane costs $1 million. So what does that say about their profits? Okay, so the total revenues are $78 million. The cost is $6 million. So the industry has a total profit of $72 million. Okay, let me just summarize this on the next slide. So this is the cartel case. In other words, they're acting like a monopolist. So the total output equals 6 airplanes. Price is $13 million. Total revenue is $78 million. Total cost is $6 million. And total profit is $72 million. All Right. That's one possibility that's on the table. Now, they may agree to each split the profits equally. In other words, they may each agree to sell 3 planes, and then they will therefore split up the profit, $36 million for each company. Possibly. It doesn't mean necessarily that will happen. It really depends on the relative bargaining position of each company. In other words, if Airbus is a larger company than Boeing, it may be that they'll end up deciding that Airbus can produce 4 planes and Boeing can produce 2. It's an agreement they have to come to among themselves. But at least we know that the total output of this industry is 6 planes and the total profit is 72 million. They will decide how to split up the profits. But they could potentially split it right down the middle, and that would bring them altogether $36 million each. Now, suppose, though, that, like I said before, they have a very powerful incentive to cheat on each other. Suppose that that does happen. Suppose Airbus says, you know what? Or no, sorry, Boeing. Suppose that Boeing decides to cheat. And they say, listen, why should we agree to this? Why don't we make a 4th plane every week? What happens now? Okay, so in other words, let's say Boeing, unknown to Airbus, decides to go ahead and start selling 4 planes per week. What effect will that have on the industry? All right, let's go back to the demand curve. Now, in order to sell 7 planes, the price, although it's hard to read from this, that would be in here somewhere. Yeah, it's a little bit difficult to read what's happening, but it turns out that according to this curve, in order for this industry to sell 7 planes, they will have to lower their price to $11 million. Okay. Now, because this is an oligopoly, if Boeing lowers their price to $11 million, Airbus will be forced to do the same thing. Otherwise, they'll lose all of their revenues. So in this case, the cheating case, what's going to happen is the following. They lower the price to 11, total industry revenues drop to 77 million, and because the cost is $1 million per plane, their profits fall to $70 million. And that means that 40 of this goes to Boeing, and 30 of this goes to Airbus. So let's do this. Let's assume in the cartel case that they've split up their profits. And here, Boeing profit equals 36 million. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to have a summary like this. It's easier than just reading all the details, I think. Okay, so in Boeing cheats, I'll call this the Boeing cheats case. Total output is 7. The price is 11. Total revenue is 77. It now costs 7 million to make those planes because that never changes. The marginal cost is $1 million. The total profit is 70, and Airbus's profits drop to 30 because they're only making 3 planes, and Boeing's goes up to 40 million because they're making 4. And now each plane brings a profit of $10 million. Okay, 11 million is the price, 1 million is the cost. So each plane that's sold generates a profit of $10 million. Okay, so all of a sudden, now remember before they were at 36 each. So Airbus is very unhappy right now. They realize that they've been cheated on, and Boeing is actually taking money out of their pocket. So how do you think they're going to respond to that? Airbus says, you know, we don't like this one little bit. Why don't we make 4 airplanes per week? That'll teach them. Oh, by the way, I want to mention here that if Airbus had been the cheater, all of this would have worked backwards. All the numbers would have been the same, except that Airbus would be at 40 million and Boeing would be at 30. So either one of them, if they cheat, you can see they can make more profits at the expense of their competitor. So now if Airbus says, you know what, well, now that we know that Boeing is cheating on us, why don't we raise our output to 4 planes per week too? That would bring the industry total to 8 planes. Let's go back to the demand curve. But now look what has to happen. In order to sell 8 planes, the price will drop to 9. All right, 9. And remember too, the cost of production never changes. So here's what's going to happen. In fact, let me put together a nice little chart here. Airbus responds. Okay, so now all of a sudden they're making 4 planes each. The price is 9. The revenue is 72. We're making $8 million, or sorry, the cost is $8 million. The profit is now 64. And each one is making 32. So guess what? Now Airbus is happy and Boeing's unhappy because their profits were just reduced from 40 to 32 million. Airbus is happy, they went from 30 to 32. So now what happens? What if Boeing says, you know what, maybe we should make 5 planes instead of 4? All right, so let's check that out. Boeing responds again. Okay, so now we're up to 9. 5 from Boeing, 4 from Airbus. Oh, and by the way, to sell 9 planes, we have to lower the price to $7 million. All right, so you see what's happening. It's starting to eat into their profits quite a bit, as a matter of fact. So we have 9 planes at 7 each. The total revenue is now 63 million. The cost is 9 million. So the industry profit is now down to $54 million, of which, let's see, Boeing is making 5 planes at a profit of $6 each. Their profits are now 30 million. And whoops, I got the wrong one, sorry. Airbus is still at 4, and they're making only 24 million. So guess what just happened? By Boeing producing a 5th plane, both companies now just lost money. That was a terrible mistake because both companies just lost. So what that means is that based on this demand curve, we will not see 9 airplanes being produced. It will be somewhere between 6 and 8. Anything past 8 means we start to make ourselves worse off. So now, because this is all a lot of details, I've put this all together in a nice little chart. Right here, so you can keep track of it all. So initially they each made 3 planes, and these are their profits. Then when Boeing went up to 4, you can see what happened. They gained and Airbus lost. And then when Airbus responded, Boeing's profits went down, Airbus went up. But if we go past that point, both of their profits just dropped. All right. And that's, of course, exactly what we don't want to see. Oh, wait, oops. Something's not right. I think I messed up this one. That should have been 24 right here. This is wrong. Sorry. All right, now we're all set. Okay, so anyway, now here's where the game theory gets involved. That is a lot of analyzing to do. It's very awkward to deal with all these tables, as I think you'll agree. And so what we can do with game theory is introduce a table or a chart where we can see all of this at once and try to figure out what they're likely to do. Because again, any of these outcomes is possible. The only thing we know for a fact is they will not produce 9 planes. Instead, they'll be somewhere between 6 and 8. Now, let's take a look at our first example of game theory. And so, yeah, they mentioned the prisoner's dilemma case. So we don't have to go through that again. In this case, we're talking about jail time for something else, but why don't we jump ahead and look at this case? And then we'll come back to prisoner's dilemma. So this is a summary of what we were doing with Airbus and Boeing. These are the only outcomes that make sense. Remember, we saw that neither side will make money, or neither side has an incentive to make 5 planes. Everything will be somewhere between 3 and 4 planes for both sides. So there's only 4 possible outcomes. And so the question is, which one will they end up with? So this payoff matrix, as it's called, consolidates. Now, by the way, this takes a little getting used to. What is this supposed to tell me? You can see that I've got Boeing and Airbus. In this first column, I'm showing the different planes that Boeing can produce. On the top, I've got the different planes that Airbus can produce. So those are if you see the blue squares or the blue triangles represent Boeing's payoffs or profits, the green triangles represent Airbus's profits. And so basically, this is taken from the table that I had up here. Let me just go double check it for a second. I just want to make sure I didn't goof it up somehow. Okay. Okay, so you recognize those numbers. Now the question is, how do they come to a decision? Now, this is where we introduce a very important concept. And that concept is something called Nash equilibrium. Okay, Nash equilibrium. What is that all about? Well, first of all, game theory was developed by 2 brilliant mathematicians, John von Neumann, during World War II. They were actually trying to use this to figure out, they were analyzing where the Japanese battleships were expected to be located. And they were using that information to try to figure out where they should put the American warships, because, of course, the Pacific Ocean is so massive and those warships move very slowly. It mattered a great deal where the ships were placed. And so von Neumann was heavily involved in the war effort to try to help figure out how to defeat the Germans and the Japanese. And so game theory really came out of all this research. And then John Nash also developed his own version of it in his doctoral dissertation at Princeton. And in fact, Nash eventually won the Nobel Prize in economics. He was also, if you've ever seen that movie, A Beautiful Mind, I'll just throw this in here as an aside. Side note, this had nothing to do with economics, but if you've ever seen this movie, John Nash was the subject matter of the movie, A Beautiful Mind. If you want to check it out, it's really more about Nash's life, because unfortunately he was a brilliant mathematician, and in fact he finished his PhD at Princeton at the age of 21, which is pretty amazing. Just getting out of Princeton itself is amazing, but getting out of there at 21 with a PhD it's just insane. And he was teaching math at, I think, Berkeley maybe, and then all of a sudden he just kind of flipped out, and it turned out he was schizophrenic. And so 30 years of his life were wasted being schizophrenic and not really being able to do anything useful. And finally, he started to recover towards the end, and he started to do more research. But his results from his doctoral dissertation were so amazing that he still was awarded the Nobel Prize in economics. So it's a very sad but uplifting story, and it's a true story. And it was featured in this movie, A Beautiful Mind, which came out, I don't know, I'm thinking 15, 20 years ago. It's totally worth your while to watch it, believe me. Let me just check this out. It's been 20 years. Okay, I figured it might have been that long, 15, 20 years. It's if that one slipped through the cracks on your list of movies that you want to watch, I would add that to it. Definitely. It's very, very well done. Very interesting. And it has Russell Crowe in it. All right, but anyway, so what Nash said in his work was that because these two sides are competing with each other, and they have an incentive, to cheat, but what they will try to do is come to a position where, even though it might not be the best outcome for either one of them, it's the best outcome for both of them together. And so what we can do here is, if you go through these cells, and I know this is tricky to do the first time you've been exposed to this, but imagine if we find ourselves with both companies producing 4 airplanes. Now, if you look at these decisions, Boeing is getting a $32 million payoff. If they drop their output to 3, they will lose $2 million. If, on the other hand, Airbus, now remember, Airbus is making their decisions across this top row. If Airbus drops their output to 3, their profits will drop to $30 million. So what this means is that if they both produce 4 planes, neither side has an incentive to change their output. So again, even though there are other squares on here where Boeing, for example, could make $36 million if they both made 3 planes, and Airbus could do the same, they both will end up producing 4 planes, because at that point, neither side has an incentive to switch. In other words, they could have a cartel where they agree to each make 4 planes or not. Either way, they will both stick with their choice of 4 airplanes. Okay, now that part went a little fast, I know. So we'll try to talk about this some more next time. But now, by the way, if they do get together and form a cartel and they're able to collude, that changes everything, because then they would each produce 3 planes, because they know that the other won't cheat. Okay, that's the whole thing here. If they both agree to produce 3 planes, remember, we saw before that they both have an incentive to cheat if there's no cartel, or even if there is a cartel for that matter. So that's why you'll only see them both produce 3 planes if they have a binding agreement among themselves. If not, when they both have an incentive to cheat on each other, they'll end up with 4 each, because that's the only square where neither side has an incentive to cheat. Okay, so we call that a Nash equilibrium, because we expect that that's where they'll wind up producing 4 and 4. And of course, they'll figure this out among themselves very quickly, and then they'll both, without even having to have an agreement, end up producing 4 planes. All right. Now, I just want to point out here that the final exam will actually not have any questions about game theory, but I think it's interesting to show it to you because it is one of the best ways of analyzing oligopoly. I also want to point out that in the chapter 18 problem set, I was not able to draw that cool matrix. So as a compromise, what I did, and you'll see, okay, what's going on here? What I did was I hope this will make sense. If you look at the way I've set these up, this 20 means this is the decision of Pepsi, and this is the decision of Coke. Okay, so in other words, I don't have that big slash here. In each of these cases, Pepsi is first, Coke is second. Down here, we have Kimberly Clark is the first number. And the second number is Procter & Gamble. And then down here in the third question, the first one is Jim rather, and the second one is Jane. Okay, so you can see, in other words, the first one is always whoever's on the left, and the second one belongs to whoever's on top. Okay, so with that being said, you should be able to, I hope, try to figure out where the Nash equilibrium is. But keep in mind, this is just for your benefit. If you look at the sample final, you'll see there aren't any questions about game theory because I think we just barely started it, and I don't think it would be right to ask you about it on the test. Everything else is there, but not that. Okay. In fact, let's take a quick peek at it. Remember, this covers 4 chapters, so there's a lot of stuff here. But you'll notice there's no questions about game theory. All right. So anyway, with all that being said, it looks like we're done for today. So our goal then is on next Tuesday to wrap up everything by covering the chapter 18 problem set and the sample final, which I'm sure we'll be able to do in one period. And then I will post the actual exam. As far as I know, I'll have to do some research. I'm still a little unclear about when the grades are due. I'll let you know how much time you can have for the test, but it'll be, believe me, it'll be at least a week. But I'll be able to tell you. Yes, the second one, you should have it ready by tonight. Yes, thank you for reminding everyone. The second midterm should be done by tonight at midnight. And then of course the final will represent the rest of the course, and then we'll be completely done. Other than that, are there any last minute questions? All right, then I'll see you all next Tuesday.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
bye.
you.
See you later. You're welcome. Bye. Hannah, yes.
Hi, I'm sorry. I just wanted a little clarification on which chapters are on tonight's midterms.
The second midterm is 7 and 14. The final is 15 through 18.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
All right, you're welcome.